Hey guys, Jaybird here, and today we're going to be doing a tutorial covering lighting. I'm going to be going over three topics today. So the first one is going to be crucial because it's how you light your map properly. It's going to be covering SSI lighting, which involves a skybox. There's a few default ones. I'm not going to be going over how to import your own, but we'll be going over how to use the existing ones and how to light your map properly. The second thing I'm going to be going over is basically their not primary lights, but more secondary lights that would be used for lamps and like street lights or anything that's not part of the, not from the environment lighting it, but something that's more an indirect light to create ambience or to maybe light up a darker room if you wanted that. And then the last thing I'm going to go over is volumetric lighting, which is kind of something that you might not be able to do if your computer is not capable of running it, but basically this is a setting that we'll have to go over in the actual game, how to turn it on, because it's in the graphical settings of Black Ops 3, and it's also something that you're going to have to use a volume to do. So we'll go over how to do all three of those right now. Alright guys, so I'm in my divide map here. I'm not actually in our test map like we usually do for these tutorials, but the reason for that is I've got some lighting already done set up for the map. So what I'm going to do here is, just really quickly, I'm not in game view, so I'm clicking F9 to get out of game view, but I can be rather in F7, which is full bright mode, or F8, which is light mode. But what I want to do is not be in game mode so I can see the volumes here. And the one I'm looking for is this sun volume. So here's the thing, if you have started creating a map and your map was blank, I've gotten a lot of questions about this and I just wanted to go over it really quickly. If your map was blank when you started making it, that's incorrect. The best way to start doing your map is not to have to add everything in yourself because it's a pain, and I haven't covered how to do that. If you watch my Radiant tutorial, which I believe was the second tutorial that I covered, it was how to generate a map, and it should have one of these volumes in your map when you start it up. It should have that default map, and this is one of the volumes. It's this giant brush that looks like a whole bunch of suns on it. Okay. So basically what this brush is going to do, and if you notice, if I go into game view and I'm outside the brush, you'll notice I have this default skybox, but then as soon as I go into the brush, you can notice it's going to change to the settings of whatever this brush is. So this brush kind of defines all the lighting and everything in here. So what I'm going to want to cover is that when we have this selected and you press N to bring up the entity window right here, this is the entity info window. It'll be a volume sun, and then what I'm going to kind of just go over here is all this stuff. We don't really need to bother with playing around with that. But the big thing here is the SSI. So we have a bunch of SSI files that we can put in here, but the first one is going to be your default one. This is the one that kind of starts up when you start your map, and I've created my own MP divide. So if you guys go over to APE, you'll notice that if you collapse all the little boxes here and you come down to the SSI one, or you could even type in into the type SSI and it'll come up with it. You can open up this and you'll notice we have a whole bunch of different SSI files which contain different skyboxes. So there's skybox models set in them. I'm not going to be going over how to set those skybox models in this or how to port them. I'm just going to kind of go over how to create a basic SSI. What you're going to want to do is, you can test out the ones that you like. So why don't we start off by just going into the SSI, and I'm going to go back inside of the map so we can see what it looks like. And I'm going to change the SSI from here. So we have all of these ones here. I've made my own, but I'll kind of go over what to do for that in a second here. But if you want to use one of the existing ones, you can just go over to the SSI one and press the ellipses right here, and you'll get a list of all the ones that we had in there. So let's say, for instance, we wanted to go with default day, which I believe is the one that you usually get when you first start up your default map. So this is probably the one the existing one you usually have. If you're doing a zombies map, a lot of people tend to go with the ZM Factory, which is the same one that the Giant had. Although you'll notice that when I change the skybox and they look kind of odd, especially when it goes black like this is because I need to bake the lighting. So remember before in my second tutorial, the Radiant one, if you don't have the lightning bolt here, even if this is too short, you'll notice that it goes away. So I can just bring it up right here. But if you don't have this, really quick, you're going to want to go to View, and then View Toolbar, Exposure. It's going to be this one here, and that will bring up the yellow lightning bolt. So we can just hit that. It'll take a little bit because my map's got quite a lot of stuff in it now, so it's going to take a second. But while it does that, I'll just kind of go over how to make your own really quickly. So I like to base it off of whatever one you're doing. So for my MP Divide, I just took any one of these. I could take Default Day, I can right click it and go Duplicate, and then say I was doing a Zombies map, I could go ZM Test, or whatever you want to call it. You can call it anything you want, really. And so this is going to be the color of your sun. You can just click on here, pick whatever color you want. I'm just going to leave it wherever it was. But basically, these two are going to be the direction of where your sun is going to be facing. So you'll notice, oh wow, it baked the lighting, but apparently it doesn't like that skybox. Probably because I have some other stuff in there as well. But what I'm going to do is just really quickly switch this back over to my Divide one, and we should be all good. Okay, so I'm going to just bake that again, and while we do that, we'll go back over here. Okay, so back in APE, you'll notice we have Pitch and Yaw. These are going to be the direction that your sun is going to be facing. So if I go back to my MP Divide one, and we just go back to Radiant, we got the lighting built. I'm going to go click F9 to go into game mode, and you'll notice we basically got some lighting here, and you'll see the shadows kind of coming from this direction over here. Sun's kind of somewhere in that direction. You can see shadows are facing this way. So if we want to change the direction of the sun, we can go into here, and I'm just going to have this open up on the side here, and I'll just shift this over so we can see it while we're in APE. And you'll notice that if I go and start changing, let's say, the pitch or the yaw, the light starts changing, but the shadow doesn't. So this, you'll have to play around with your settings to get them to do what you want and where you want the sun aimed. But then when you want the shadows to update, every time you want to do that, you're going to have to hit bake the lighting, or else the shadows aren't going to change. So once you've got that, then you have your lighting in the direction that you want it going. It should be good. Lens flare, pitch offset. So this is basically the same idea as this, but then it adds an offset of, and then in this case I have 0. So let's say I were to have a lens flare, and the way you would set that is right here. So these values, usually you want to keep them at 0 because the sun should be in the direction that the sun's coming from, or the light's coming from. But if you want to set the lens flare, you'll see it's not set. You can hit the ellipses here. My map's a dark map, so I don't want a lens flare, but this is the lens flare that would happen when you look at the sun directly. And you can choose from a few different ones here. These are all the default ones, but pick whichever one you feel would fit with it. Obviously, they got the sector one here, which is specifically a sun, so that one might look half decent. So you can pick whichever one you want there. Stops. So this is going to be kind of like the brightness. The higher the value, the more bright it is. So let's go back to our side view here. So you'll notice if I go down to like 0, that's really dark. Like 10, 15, 20. It really depends on what you're going for. It also bases it off of your skybox, so how dark your skybox is, and a few other settings as well. But this is basically your brightness for the map, so you play around with that until you get what you want. Specular composition is going to be basically how shiny the specular maps are in your map. So I could put this up to like 10, and you'll notice, whoo, wow, looks like thunder and lightning just went off. But yeah, basically, you can play around with this, you know, go with however specular you want it to be. In my case, I found that a specular of 1.5 looked not too bad, and the penumbra inches, I believe this has to do with your ambient occlusion, and I think the default 1.5 was fine. I didn't really play too much around with this one. Dynamic shadows. This would be in the case of if your light were to create shadows for moving objects, say the zombies, the players, whatever you want. If you want the sunlight specifically, you can have normal lights cast dynamic shadows, but in this case this would be for specifically the sun. So have that checked, unchecked depending on what you're going for. I don't play with any of the cookie settings. I'm not 100% sure what they're for. I'll probably do an advanced lighting tutorial if we do find a use for these, but as of right now, I'm just going to leave that for blank. If you want volumetric lighting done from your sun, you can leave this checked, or check it if you want it to. It really depends on what you're going for. I was able to create lights like these. We'll go over the volumetric stuff in a little bit here, but basically I'm able to create all these nice volumetric lights due to the sunlight. But basically I think this is probably good enough. We're going to just kind of quickly go over the last few here. Is the skybox. That's going to be a model of what you see in the sky. So I've kind of ported my own one over. You can use whatever existing skybox you want. If you look for, if we get rid of the types there in the name, we just do skybox underscore, and under T7 there's a few different skyboxes here that Treyarch's provided. They might even have some in here. Yeah. So pick whichever ones you want. The ones with this little icon is a little mesh, means it's a model. So you can see, you can even preview it in here. You can pick different ones. Yeah, the factory one, I think I might have overwritten something. So that's why it was black before, but you'll notice all the other ones are all looking good. I clicked on the texture instead of the light, or the mesh there. But that's going to be it for SSI lighting. Once you've finished changing all the ones that you have, all the stuff in APE, it should be set. And you have it set in here, it's good. You don't need to worry about SSI 2 and 3. The reason why I have mine set here is I have a lightning effect that I have in my map, which I switch over to a second SSI file when basically in my script, if I have a lightning effect, I would change quickly over to the very bright lightning skybox or SSI file that I have. But that's specifically for scripting, and that's way more advanced than what I'm going to be covering in this. You can leave a lot of this stuff default, to be honest. I changed this to what they had here, but to be honest, I don't even know what this user-defined SSI is doing. This might be what it chooses on the default one. So if you want to, maybe what Treyarch had was they had their default one the same as, so SSI 1 the same as SSI. So maybe keep those two the same. I haven't really experimented with trying to set it to something different. But yeah, that's going to cover the SSI lighting. So now we're going to kind of cover over two different types of lights. So if I go and click B to bring up the entity browser, I can go to unsorted and come down to light right here. And you can just drag that on. So this is going to be a base light for your map. The thing is, with my skybox, I actually have to bump up my settings quite a bit because of how dark the map is and the way that the fog is affecting the light. So you'll notice that my light here that I dragged on didn't seem to really do much. And in fact, I'm going to just drag this over a bit. But if I select my light, like you'll notice that it's not really lighting up much there. You can see a little bit of light there. But that's because of my world spawn settings in the SSI. It's making it a lot harder for to see stuff. But if I start bringing up the stops, like this is the exact same one that was in our SSI stops. So if I went back to my SSI, it's got the exact same setting that stops, which is your brightness. It's going to be the exact same thing. So the color here, same idea. You can click the ellipses here, change the color of the light. Don't worry too much about these two. Specular compositions is kind of the same idea. You can make things more specular with the light, but the stops, your main thing there. If you want the light to cast shadows, so right now on default it doesn't cast shadows. So you'll notice when I had that light right here, it's not really casting too much shadows here. So if I uncheck this, you can see the box and everything here is starting to cast shadows now. So this would take up more memory to be able to do this, more processing power, but you know, if that's what you're going for, you want the shadows, you can leave this unchecked. So client side, server side, that's for scripting stuff. You don't need to really look into any of the scripting stuff unless you know what you're doing and you want to be able to script your light to do something specific. but we're just going over some basic stuff right now. So this is a primary Omni light. So this is when you do primary Omni light, it is a complete circle, and that's the way that it works. We're just going to kind of go over a few things here. Don't need to look over bulb length. Cut on will be basically how you'll notice like how there's like an inner radius where it's not lit, and then that's where it starts. So basically if I do 50, it's 50 units from the center is where the light would start working. So if I did like 100, which would be the size of my radius, so I have no light. So let's say I did 90, I only have 10 units for the light to actually kind of work there. So I'm going to just set that back down to 0, because that's what a natural light would be more like. We got fall off. If you want the light to be more like a spotlight, you can get rid of the fall off. The fall off has brightness at the very center, and then all the way to the edge it will fade basically. If you keep this on, you can actually change that fall off distance. So if I did let's say 2, actually let's go how about 12 was pretty not that much. So let's say if I went 30, you'll see it starts fading off at about 30 units, and you know the fade off is a bit different now. So I'm going to put it back to 12 for default. We're just playing around with the settings and just showing you what they all mean. Don't worry too much about the FOV. You could this is more related to like the spotlight, which we'll go over in a second here. But a lot of these are for the spotlight. Radius is going to be how far out the light is going to reach. So it's currently set to 100 units. I could set that to 200 and it goes even further. So it really depends on what you're going for here. I'll just set it back to 100. Roundness is not going to do anything with a normal Omni light. This is specifically for spotlight. Same with super eclipse. Volumetric lighting. If you want to have volumetric lighting, I'd select these two here and you can boost it. So you'll notice it doesn't look like there's very much volumetric lighting coming from that. I can't really see the light from that that little spot there. So if I select this and I go back to game view here, I can go down to my volumetric lighting, have it checked, and I can boost it. So let's say I went with 10. You can notice that's quite a bit, but that's what volumetric lighting would look like with boosted value of 10. So if you're trying this in line with me doing this right now, you'll notice that your light probably didn't do that. That's because, and I'm going to go over this in a second, you have to have it's a volume called a fog volume. So if I kind of just, where is it? That's sky, sun. I'm just hiding these right now. This is Umbra. That's a prefab. And there's our fog. Okay, so this is a fog volume. So anything in here is capable of creating fog, which then allows you to do volumetric lighting, because the lighting for volumetric lighting is really just having the light affect the fog. So we'll go over that in a little bit here. If we go back to our light, we're just about done with all the settings here. If you don't want it volumetric, you can keep that unselected. A lot of this is for scripting stuff. And yeah, that's basically going to be it for the basic type of light. So now if we go back up to the settings here, primary type, and we switch it over to a spotlight, you'll notice we have a completely different light now. So we'll go over to the settings for spotlight, and you can actually rotate these and change how you want them to affect the world around it, and you can use them in really cool different ways. And you'll notice the lights that I did for here were spotlights, as well as the ones down in the alleyway back here are spotlights. We'll go over some of that stuff really quickly here. So we'll go back to our light. So the light stuff that we're going over, I haven't really figured out too much what bulb length does, but cut on is kind of really useful in this case. Like before, it's going to start the light at the distance that you want to do it. So let's say I did 50. You'll notice it's only going to start the light at 50, which is quite useful. For instance, when I did my lights like this, let's say I didn't want the light to accidentally reflect something that got close to the light, but I only want it to light up the front here. Or for instance, I have this light back here, if I can select it, and I wanted it to only start at a certain distance and I didn't want to light up the back accidentally, so I push it forward slightly. I do the same sort of effect with here. I don't want to be this prefab here, but I don't want the light to accidentally light up the back of this because the light is actually starting here. So I do the same idea. I use the cut on, which is quite handy. So we'll just kind of go back out of the prefabs here and go back to our spotlight. So basically with spotlights, you can use the cut on to do a bunch of cool tricks, which are quite handy. So I'm going to just bring that back down to 0 since spotlight's starting right back at the origin. Fall off, same idea as before. Fall off distance, same idea. FOV, that is going to be basically how so the distance is still radius, but this is going to be how wide that radius is going to be. So like I can change that. I believe you can't go 180 because then you basically have a wall of light. So anything really below 180 is doable. So it depends on what you're going for, but 90 is your default. Near light edge, I believe that has to do with how the light reacts as it falls off as well. Radius, exact same. Roundness, now this is quite useful for depending on what you're trying to go for. You'll notice it kind of looks like a square shape. In fact, if I rotate this down back to the ground slightly, actually I'm going to just get rid of the angles so I can show you a bit better. Where's the angles? So I'm going to zero out the angles, and you'll see that as it's aimed at the ground, it's a square, but it's like a rounded off square. So if we go back to our roundness, if I put it to 1, we get a perfect circle, but then if I put it to 0, we get a perfect square. So you can kind of switch between those depending on what you really want to do. In a lot of the cases, stuff like this, these would be completely squared off lights because of the way the light works. So I did square lights there. Whereas these ones are completely rounded off lights because of the way the light is for these ones. So it really depends on what you're going for, how round you want the light or not. So we'll just kind of go back here and select our light again, and I'm going to switch it back to a full roundness light. Actually, I'm going to switch it back to a perfect square, because then I'm going to show you how, because as of right now it's a perfect square. Say you wanted a rectangle though, you can use this super eclipse. So the way this value works is you have 4 values. This is going to be a ratio all the way up to 1 for all 4 of these values. So 0, I'm just going to go over these 2 first, the second and the 4th one. The second one, you'll notice, is this width here. So it's related to your radius, so it would have reduced the 100 to 50 in this case for this side, or I could do this to 0.2 on this one and it would have done 0.2 of 100. So it depends on what you want the shape to be. You can use those two, and they default them to 1, 1, which gives you a perfect square. These two, 1 and 3, are more of a fall off value. So you'll notice when you're looking at the light, you have this outer edge, which is represented by 1, 1, and this inner edge, which is represented by 0.75, 0.75. So this is kind of where like a fall off kind of happens. So I could put this down to like 0.5 and maybe even 0.2, and you'll notice that it kind of falls off a bit more there. It depends on what you're going for, like usual, but these values are really helpful for creating different shapes of lighting. Like you see, this is more of a rectangle, so I used the super eclipse to kind of shape it to the shape of the light there. And then we're going to just really quickly, same idea for volumetric lighting. You can select these two, and spotlights as volumetric lighting are probably one of the most amazing things about Black Ops 3, because you can get some really cool effects now. But with where is it? Volumetric lighting selected, we can do the same boost thing that we did before. Get some really cool looking lighting going, and you put these on like a lot of things and it'll make your map look really cool, really slick. Depends on what you're going for, like usual. A lot of this stuff's used for scripting, so that's going to be basically it for the basic lights that you're going to be able to add into your map. I'm going to really quickly go over that volume, that fog volume. So let's say you wanted a fog volume. You're going to want to click B to bring up the entity browser, and you're going to want to go down to volumes. So if you come down to volumes, you'll see you'll have this lit fog. You can just drag one of these guys on, and you can shape it out the same way you would do a brush. Don't cut this brush. In fact, all volumes I would not suggest cutting. Just keep them the square shape that they are, cover the area that you want the fog in. So that's how you add a fog brush. Once you have one in, press N to bring up the entity info, and you have FSI, fog files. So the default ones are probably going to be good for you, but they depend on what you're going for. The default one for the Giant was ZM Factory Volumetric. So you can just select this one and you get different fog values. So you'll notice it's relatively the same to the one that I was using. I changed slightly different values, but you can kind of go in and pick different fog levels. This one really doesn't have much of a fog at all, but pick whatever one you feel best suits you. You can go into APE and find the FSI files and change it to whatever you want as well. But for this case, I'm going to go back to my default divide one that I created. The same idea goes for when you have your fog selected here. You can have multiple different ones. This one defines what your default one is, your FSI, which probably explains what the SSI one was, because when it was SSI with no number, that was your default. So this is going to be your default one, which usually you want to have the same as your other one here. I have this one selected because that one's loaded, and these ones aren't loaded because I'm not using any other types of fogs. In the Giant, however, they have a second one selected, so they have their base fog level, and then they have their second one for the dog round, so that they use that for scripts. But in my case, I'm doing a multiplayer level, I don't need that selected. So it depends on what you're going for. If you really want to look at the one that they have in the Giant, I would suggest loading up the Giant and finding one of these fog brushes in your map, and you can actually see which ones they had selected and all the values they had there, it's also really useful to use their existing map files for anything. If you want to find something that they did and it was in one of those maps, it's there for you to learn from, and that's the reason why they gave us them. So I really suggest checking that stuff out, and that's going to be it for this tutorial, guys. I hope it helps you guys out. I had a lot of lighting questions recently and over the last month or so, but I hope this helps you guys out. Don't forget to comment, rate, and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. See ya.